As you may have heard, Redwood is a full stack framework, and so far I've only really worked on the front end. We created a couple web pages, our home page and about page, and that's about it. So let's get involved with the back end here. So we spent most of our time in web. Now we're going to go to API. And our blog isn't really going to be much of a blog if we don't have any actual blog posts. Let's start creating those, and the natural place to store those in this case would be the database. So we're going to go to API DB, and we have this schema.prisma. Redwood uses Prisma as our database sort of interface layer. Makes it simple to talk to a database. You define your database tables in here in this schema.prisma file. And we have a default one here just to show an example of how it works, but we're not going to need that. So we can get rid of that. And let's create our post database table. And Prisma is going to call these models. So we have a model post. And what columns is this database table going to have? It's going to have an ID, which is just going to be a simple integer. And these are some special Prisma syntax here. At ID means it specifies it as the primary key. And then we're going to default it to auto increment for us. So we don't have to worry about setting that ID. It'll just automatically create one when you create a new record. And then a blog post usually has a title, which is going to be a string. And it has a body, which is also going to be a string. And then finally, we'll store a created at date timestamp. And what we can do is we can default this to now. So whenever we create a record, it'll automatically stick right now in it. Okay, so there's our schema file. But we need to actually apply it to the database. So Prisma has a utility called migration. And we can run those with yarn redwood prisma migrate dev. And this performs the migration in sort of a development mode where it expects there could be problems, there could be errors, and not to freak out. There's another deploy mode, which is more serious. And that assumes you've already tested all your changes and you know they're going to work. But for now, we're just going to stick with dev. And what this will do is create a snapshot of what the database should look like at this point in time. So it could be reapplied to the database in another environment, like in your production environment. So we're going to give it a name, and we're just going to call this create post. And it says your database is now in sync. And if we look in here now, we got a devdb. This is a SQLite database for local development here. It creates that for us. And then if you go in this migrations folder, you see it created a folder with a timestamp and then that name that we gave it. And if you look in there, there's an actual SQL script. So this is the actual SQL that will run against the database in order to bring it up to speed with our current schema definition. And it created this lock file. You shouldn't mess with that. Of course, now that we have a database table, we want to be able to get some data in there so we can populate some blog posts and make sure it works. But how can we do that without creating all of those pages manually, right? You'd have to create a form to be able to fill in, to create a record, and then you have to create another page to be able to pull the records out and view them. So we run into this scenario a lot in web development land. So what we did is we created another generator. This is called the scaffold generator. Yarn, redwood, generate scaffold. And then the name of the model you want to scaffold. In this case, it's post. And you can do capital post or lowercase post. You'll see here that created a couple files. And before we go look at those, we'll see what it did. So we saw the server over here reload. So it knows something's going on. No change here, but the scaffold we generated, post, is going to make a URL for us, which is the plural version of that model. So posts. And then we have this here. So this is posts. And look at this. There's a new post. And there's a message here. No post yet. Do you want to create one? Yes, I do. And I'm going to call this my first post. If I save that, post created, and now there's a record in here. I can go and create another one. Now I've got two. And you can go in here and you can edit these. Or you can even delete them. And you get a warning. Are you sure you want to do that? So with one generate command, Redwood created all these pages necessary to be able to perform these CRUD actions. CRUD, C-R-U-D, create, update, retrieve, delete. Those four actions are very common. It's sort of the four things you do with data in the database. And now you can do it all through these pages and it didn't take any manual work at all. So let's see what that actually created on the back end. So we're still here in API. And if we look in source GraphQL, you'll see there's now this posts.stl. STL is schema definition language. So this defines the fields and types for your GraphQL schema. And you'll see here it created the post type itself, and then a couple queries to get all posts and to get one post. And GraphQL sort of has a recommendation for these input types when you are creating and updating data. So we created a create input type and a update input type. And then the mutation are our other three actions. So there's create, update, and delete. And you'll see here the input, takes the input types, update takes the input type in addition to the ID of the record you want to update. Delete takes just the ID. Likewise up here, post doesn't take any parameters because it's just going to return all of them. And then viewing a single post is going to take one parameter, which is the ID of the post you want to view. It also created a services file. So you see posts.js. So normally in GraphQL, you may have heard of GraphQL resolvers. And normally that's when you have these query and mutation types, you say for the posts query, here's how to resolve that. Here's how to get the data ready to return for posts. And normally you would manually write these resolvers. But in Redwood, we automatically map a resolver to the service. So if you have an SDL type posts, it'll look for a posts service with a function called posts. Or up here you have create, update, and delete. You'll see in our service we have create, update, and delete. So as long as they're named the same, they'll automatically be mapped. And then within that function, we just make Prisma calls. So this is Prisma syntax here. DB, which is an instance of the Prisma client, then the model name, and then Prisma has all these functions for retrieving data. Find many, find unique, create, update, and delete. Okay, so that's all the code that was created on the back end for us. What about to the front end? So if we go in here, we'll see that there are now pages, and we nest these in a post directory for you. There's the 4 main pages, the list of all pages, one single post, creating a new post and editing a post. Delete doesn't have a page that you go to. And then we also got a layout. There's a post layout, and this contains the title on the left, post, and then the button, the new post button on the right. And you'll see we got several components here also nested within post. So these are the actual components that display the post or a single post, and then we have these cells. We're going to talk about those more in a minute. And then finally, if we go to routes, we'll see it created a set here, wrapping just like our blog layout, except this one wrapped in the posts layout, and there's our posts. So there's the list of all posts, there's a single post, there's editing a post, and there's creating a new post. So that was pretty neat, right? Redwood made all that for us. And you may notice this, some things are plural and some things are singular, and the way that we ended up coming with that naming scheme is sort of however you would talk about these in natural language. So if you said, I'm going to edit a post, singular, because you're only going to edit one post, but I'm going to view all the posts plural in that case. So if you find yourself confused between singular and plural, it's just whichever is most natural, and your regular speech is probably going to be the way it is. Okay, so this scaffold is great, but we're not going to expect a user coming to our blog to view blog posts like this, right? And we're especially not going to let them edit or delete them. So we need to actually present them in a way for the normal guest user. And a natural place for that would be the homepage, right? So you'd view the latest posts here on the homepage. We're going to want to show a list of all the posts, but the internet is not instantaneous, so we probably want some kind of a loading screen. And if there was some kind of error when we were retrieving them, we'd probably want to show an error message. And it starts to be a lot of things you need to worry about just to get a simple component on the page. But what if you didn't have to worry about those things? And this is where we introduce the Redwood cell. So let's generate one of those for our homepage. We're going to want to show all the blog posts on the homepage. And just to avoid confusion, instead of saying, normally I would say yarn redwood generate cell post, because we want to show posts. But we already have posts involved with the scaffold that we generated, and it can be kind of confusing if they both have the same name. So let's choose a different name. Let's say article. And in this case, we want to show multiple articles on the homepage, right? So we're going to put plural here. And what did that create? So if we look in here into our components, there's our articles cell, and it created the articles cell.js, and then it also created a mock, story, and test file. We won't talk about those yet, but those are coming soon. So we're just worried about this for right now. And what do we have in here? We have an articles query, and that looks like GraphQL. And then here's a component called loading, and here's a component called empty, and here's a component called failure, and here's a component called success. So what this is, what a cell is you may have heard it also referred to as a single file component. So sort of everything is encapsulated within this one file. The data fetching, what to do while the data is fetching. So this loading component will be rendered while we're waiting to hear back from the server with the actual data. Or if there is no data, it'll render the empty state here, the empty component. If there's an error, it'll render the failure component and pass the error in, you can display. And then finally, if the data does come back and there is some data, it will render the success component, and that data will be here in articles. And in this case, it just loops over them. Now, the one thing about a cell is it's pretty closely tied to the data. And we have no articles data, right? We just named it that because of the name clash with the scaffold we generated. So really we want to get the posts. So we'll need to make a slight change to this. It just called this articles. You'll see articles, 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 because that was the name of the cell. And that's generally probably how you'll come about it, is you'll have a cell for a database table and those names will all match up properly. But in this case, we're going to change it. So we're going to say it's going to be called articles, but really behind the scenes, I want you to call posts. And then we can leave articles here and here. And this isn't rendering anywhere yet. This is just a component in isolation. So now let's put it into the home page. And these will import. And you notice there was nothing exported here called article cell. So where did that name come from? We've got a Babel plugin that sort of creates that pseudo name for us. So you just reference the file name like you do anything else, components, article cell, and it knows what to pull in correctly. So instead of just rendering the text home here, let's render article cell. And there we go. So remember, we created 2 posts in the scaffold, and here they are, 1 and 2. Doesn't tell us much, just has the ID. So let's get a little more data here for those. So we'll go to our query, and we say we also want the title and the body and the created at. If we save that and reload, there's all that data now. And that's pretty ugly, so let's format that. Let's go back to our cell here, and we know we're going to be in the success component. And let's return a little semantic HTML here. So we're going to loop over each article. We're going to create an article tag with the key. And we'll have a header with the title and in the body, and then we'll have the posted at date. There we go. Not bad, not bad. And that cell, since it's a little self-contained item, we can use that in other places as well, if we ever wanted to show multiple blog posts like this. So let's take a little sidebar here. How is all this data moving through Redwood? Where's it coming from? How does this work? Let's take a look here. So we've got our browser. In this case, this was called post cell. And when we made a GraphQL query, there was a GraphQL payload that went across the internet back to our server. And if you deploy serverless, then this would become something like a Lambda function, but you can kind of ignore that for now. Just pretend this is a server running somewhere. So that request comes up, and the post SDL is going to be used to make sure that data is valid, the parameters you gave it and requested are correct. And assuming they are, right, it's going to use the pseudo resolver that we've created in our service. So it goes to the PostJS service, looks up the posts function, and then in there's Prisma. So Prisma then is going to write SQL, and that's going to be in your database somewhere. In this case, it's local right now, SQLite, but in your production environment, it's probably in a remote server somewhere. And then the data comes back, and then it's returned from the service back to GraphQL. GraphQL packages it up and returns it through the internet back down to the browser, and that's displayed on the page like that. Okay, so we've got our home page here with our list of blog posts. Let's make a detail page so you can view a single post sort of in isolation on its own page. How are we going to do that? Well, we turn these into links and then go somewhere. So we'll need a page at least, right? A detail page. And that page needs to get the data from somewhere. And you could post it through a prop, let's say, and give it through to the detail page. But since it's retrieving data, that sounds like a job for a cell. That's what we like cells to do, right? Whenever you need to get something from the database to display it, that's usually the job for a cell. So instead of posting the whole article data over, what if we just tell the article detail page, hey, here's the ID of the post I want to view. So let's create an article page. All right, generate a page here and call it article. So if we go here now, we have an article page, but we don't know which article to display. So let's say this is going to look something like article/1, which doesn't exist yet. So what we can do is come back here and go to our routes. And we'll say here for the article page, there's going to be a parameter, and we call these route parameters. And in this case, we're going to say whatever is the next part of the path here, put that in a variable called ID. So now if we go back, we're getting a little farther, missing parameter ID. And this is actually an error caused by the default page that we generated. So if you look at the article page, there's a link here to itself. Well, now there needs to be an ID in here, and there isn't an ID. So it would look like this. That's really what it needs to be now. So now we're okay again. But in this case, we're not going to need this much longer. So let's just delete that link. And our page is rendering. So you can change out this ID. It doesn't really seem to make any difference right now, but you can change it. But how we get access to that ID. So what we do is here in the page, we say, hey, when you're called page, the router is going to give you that route parameter. So it's going to take the ID from here, and it's going to make it available in here. And we can prove that by saying my ID is ID. And you see there, my ID is 1. 2. Okay, we're getting closer. So now we're just about ready, I think, to actually get that record from the database now that we know which one to get. So let's generate a cell. In this case, it's going to be singular article because we're only viewing one, right? Article cell. And we're going to want to render that here. So let's get rid of this. And we'll say article cell. And we don't need our link and routes anymore. If we go to our article cell, in this case, we need to put a post here, right? Because it's not going to view, it's going to get a single post. But it's still expecting an ID from somewhere. Where's it going to get that from? So what happens right now? I'll see. $ID was not required. Where did this message come from? It came from right here in this failure component. So there was an error rendering this cell, and it rendered failure instead. That was very handy. So what we need to do is we need to get this ID in. And the way we do that is, now that we have ID available, we can pass it in as a prop here. So it automatically takes any parameter that's passed in and makes it available here in the query. In this case, the name of ID. Now if we go back, oh, it's not quite right. The message changed though. $ID got invalid value 1. Int cannot represent non-integer value 1. So you see what's coming in here? 1 is coming in as a string, and that's just the nature of URLs. Everything in here is considered a string. So what we can do is tell Redwood, hey, when you see that, turn that into something else for me. In this case, we want it to be an int. So we can type coerce it here. And you see that already happens for us in our scaffolds. And now we save and reload. Ooh, look what we have. We're back to we were on our articles page, right? At first, it just rendered just the ID. So now if we go to article cell, and we're going to get our title and our body and our created at. And let's go ahead and replace this with that same HTML. And in this case, it's not articles anymore, right? It's just a single article. So we'll just get rid of this. Ooh, we have our first blog post. And we'll see if we change this ID. Ooh, there's a second post. Now, we kind of lost our layout. Remember, we had our header up there. That's gone. And that's going to be in the routes. So now we're just going to take this and move it into our set. So there's the home page and the about page. We can move that right in there. And now when we go to an article, we'll see it wrapped. And the last thing we need to be able to do is be able to get to these detail pages. Let's add a link. So in articles cell, in this header here, we can link it. And this is where we're going to link to a route. So route, and then we're going to take our name, right, which is article. And then we need to pass it the ID. And we know this article's ID because we have it right here. And then we need to import link again. And then we'll have links to our articles. There's article 1, article 2. So that's pretty nice, right? We've got these nice little self-contained cells that contain all the data fetching and the logic for displaying a single thing. In this case, article cell is displaying one article, and articles is displaying multiple articles. We've got some copying and pasting here again. So let's clean that up. Let's just create a single component to house this data. So we'll come in here. Yarn Redwood generate component article. And so now we have article cell, and then we just have article. And what we'll do is we'll put this there. And this is going to take in an article as a prop. And now our link is going to be in here instead. And now we will import. Homepage looks good. And then we'll do the same thing in the single article cell here. In this case, we don't need a key because we're not looping through anything. And we'll take our import. Excellent. Okay, that's it for chapter 2. Come on back for chapter 3.